Good morning, friends. Welcome back to our Thursday morning get-together. We're going to talk with Ed Thomas. We've talked with before. Dr. Thomas is a professor of health and physical science, also the president of the Iowa Association of Health, Physical Education, and Recreation and Dance. Also state coordinator for the President's Challenge Physical Initiative. Very impressive background in judo, yoga, advanced physical training, self-defense, history of physical training, military gymnastics, calisthenic, and other kinds of fitness-based skills. And he's have you been associated with the military as well as sometimes in your career as well?
I volunteered for the draft in 1967 and really got interested in the way soldiers train. And so, yeah, I've been involved in that in one way or another since 1967.
Are we doing that right? Soldiers training correctly?
Well, we've been losing ground in fitness both in and out of the military for at least 3 or 4 generations. And so the military has suffered also. I worked at the U.S. Army Physical Fitness School before coming home to Iowa. I was down in Fort Benning for 7 years. And our whole country's struggling right now to figure out how to get itself fit.
I think you're right. It's for health reasons and cosmetic reasons. The cosmetics teams tends to drive this discussion rather than health. But I don't care what drives it as long as we get there.
That's a good point. If you look all the way back to antiquity, there are 3 reasons for physical education. One is national productivity, so that as we divide the labor and build ourselves a country, that we're all able to do our job. And the second is homeland security, so that we can defend our borders. And the third one, then, if you divide the labor and you secure the borders, then you're free to develop culture, which is the search for the divine wisdom of life.
Right.
And so those are all 3 very important reasons, way beyond personal.
Well, I was just thinking about it, for instance, when the Japanese economy got really strong and then went at us and it started to do extremely well back in the late 70s and early 80s. They'd show us, what are the Japanese doing? How come they're kicking our butts? And they'd show us news stories of the Japanese workers before they even went to work or went to their office or went to the factory. They'd be out there doing group calisthenics. Do they do that anymore? Do they still do that? Or was that just a short-lived phenomenon, do you think?
I think they still do it a lot more than we. Our country did this stuff pretty well before 1920, but we got it, of course, and we've talked about that before, from our European ancestors. Had some highly developed systems of group exercise.
It used to be the Greek ideal. We talked about this before. Physical fitness is just as important as mental fitness or in spiritual fitness, and it's part of the balance of human psychology, and we've neglected it.
It's led to a very interesting discussion about how we define fitness, because we've had to rethink it. We've gone through that period of cosmetic fitness, the way you look.
Right.
Then we went through the organic fitness, how well the heart works.
Right.
And then in the 1990s, we began to talk about the way we move. There was a fellow by the name of Thomas Curitin from the University of Illinois, who was known as the father of physical fitness in the United States for PE teachers, and he said it was all 3 of them. They're all equally important. We've been fighting over which one should be dominant, and so we're having to rediscover how to move well again.
Well, I don't know to what degree I'm about to tell you is widespread here in Iowa, but every time I've talked about this in the past and start to idealize the getting back and physically fit and doing this in the schools, I'll get 2 or 3 calls from people saying, Mickelson, what you're telling us is really kind of cool, but I go in and out of the schools every day. I deliver things in the school, or I'm not working there, but I see what's going on. I go past the gym, the so-called phys ed classes. You have 2 or 3 kids out there pretending to play volleyball, while the rest of the phys ed class sitting there over on the stands on their cell phones, and the phys ed instructor is sitting in a chair in the corner, and she's on her cell phone, and she's doing. They're really not even using their phys ed time in a real school situation with any expectations or any accountability or any measurement of success or any criteria. They're just screwing off.
Yeah, there's been a dialogue going on in the field of physical education for generations. You got those folks who just weren't interested in fitness. I recall calling Hans Kraus back in the 70s before he died, and he was the guy who did a fitness test for kids my age, and we failed so badly back in the 50s that President Eisenhower created the President's Council.
I remember when the Kennedys.
That's right. And Hans
about.
Kraus was Kennedy's back doctor.
Was he a doctor of feel-good? Gave him all that medication and got him in trouble?
He told the president movement could help cure him. He came from Austria. He said to me that he was really surprised when he got here in 1938 that Americans moved so poorly.
What did he mean by that?
That we were clumsy, we had very poor posture. And this is 1938 when he got here. So even by then, we had begun to lose some notion of how to move well. And when he called upon the physical educators to focus more on fitness, and they outright told him, we're not interested in fitness anymore. If you go back to the 70s here in Iowa, I remember giving a presentation at the state convention, a very controversial presentation on weight training, and I was hammered. Weight training was inappropriate, particularly for women. This is 1970s now, so we've gone through a tremendous change.
Inappropriate in what way?
It's inappropriate because it'll make them muscle-bound. It'll hurt their joint. This is my generation. My parents' generation said, look, life is tough. Do pull-ups. My generation said, kinder, gentler. Let's lean forward and see how far we can stretch on this little box here.
Yes.
So, unfortunately, when we let it go in 1920, we began to lose a lot of that knowledge. That's what we've had to rebuild. And starting in the 1990s, we've seen a tremendous shift back. We have schools now across Iowa that are working on hip angle and sitting, desk angles. You might remember when the desks were slanted. All of that makes a difference.
You mean the top of the desk was slanted and you lift up the lid and put your junk in there?
Well,
was that a bad thing or a good thing?
This is an interesting story because the Scandinavians have known for a long time that if you sit at a 90-degree hip angle, it's 30 degrees too much for a human hip to accommodate. In other words, the horse riding position is the optimal way for a person to sit. 90 degrees, the lumbar curve disappears because it has to pick up that extra 30 degrees of demand. So in other words, we flatten out our spine every day. But we didn't suffer as much as children today because we had slanted desks, and so we didn't compromise the upper part of the chest.
The kids are having problems because they're carrying 20, 25 pounds around in a book bag.
That's right. It's exacerbated by load bearing. But when you put a child on a flat working surface at a 90-degree hip angle, by second grade, you can begin to see the deformities in the children.
So the desk angle, that was actually a smart way to do that.
Yes. Imagine asking an architect or an artist to work on a flat surface, but yet we ask children to learn to write. And writing is especially damaging because they have to rotate the paper away from their dominant arm, so they rotate the spine in a C curve. So very soon the muscles start to get imbalanced. And then to make it worse, we don't move off the ground anymore, so we don't have the children reach overhead and load bear, so they don't straighten the upper body. We're not using gravity properly to mold the tissue.
Interesting.
So it's a downward spiral.
And then we mess them up in their heads.
Well, it's an interesting relationship because we know that fitness is directly related to academic performance. And if we define fitness in terms of motion, then we clearly see that as we deprive them of these motor patterns, we indeed impact brain development.
I need to take a short time out here. Dr. Thomas is here. Ed Thomas is my fitness guru, and we connected several years ago now, and I think it's just I find this a fascinating conversation, mainly because I get the benefits. I really understand the benefits. Huge difference in the quality of life for an adult. And I can imagine what the quality of life for unfit kids could be if we did these kinds of things in a planned, well thought out, well executed, conceived way, in a formal way. It should be part of the lifestyle of the next generation. If we did this smartly, we would extract benefits, health benefits for a generation. I think that's kind of cool. A brief time out, back in a moment at 284-1040 or 800-469-4295 in a moment. My guest here in the studio is Dr. Ed Thomas, and we're talking about the next generation and our kids and what we could be doing with them right now. One of the first things that is cut during economic times of distress, a couple of the things that are usually cut would be band, art, and physical education. And the other part of it is, we do this all strangely too. I remember when my son was in high school, he was involved with sports all year round, and he performed at a high level in soccer, and he played baseball, and he was never unactive. Yet they had him doing silly phys ed things and the towel snapping stuff, and wasting about 4 hours or 5 hours a week out of his academics that were for him unnecessary. There's a one size fits all. That's kind of silly, don't you think? Although if they had been training him and doing other things, he would have benefited. But playing dodgeball is kind of a silly waste of time.
That's the big issue. What constitutes a quality physical education curriculum? And this disdain for fitness in the field of physical education was driven by the public. After 1920, people that were interested in what we call fitness were made fun of in magazines and journals and cartoons. So the physical education field simply reflected a value in the system. And there's a real art to transforming kids. And to do it well, it takes a long, long time. There are three components of physical education dating back to the origins of the field. There is what we call restorative gymnastics. Those are the techniques that we teach our children so that they can become the best physically that they can. The next is the martial component, to teach them how to respond appropriately to aggression. Wrestling is an example.
Okay.
And then the final is the pedagogical, which are the sports and the games and the theory and the dance. So all three are important. And wrestling was our martial art. We threw boxing away after the 1920s. We used to have a lot of boxing here in Iowa. I was always given some room for the martial, which is wrestling.
And it's also extremely interesting to see the growth spurt of mixed martial arts, and the extreme boxing and extreme mixed martial arts is flourishing, and that is extraordinarily one-on-one wrestling, boxing, karate, jiu-jitsu, and all those judo. It mixes all of those things, and there is, for guys at least, there is an allure to that level of physical combat one-on-one. I can't explain it. Do you have a theory?
Well, I grew up in it. I grew up boxing and wrestling. I taught judo for about 30 years. So for me, it was never about conquering someone else. It was simply something that was in my soul, something that I felt I needed to do. You know, we don't ask our law enforcement guys to be weak. We want them to be strong.
Absolutely.
We want our National Guard to be strong. And so from childhood on, I should be prepared to defend myself against aggression. We had that conversation about the diocese over in Davenport, which is a great example. And that I was one of the little boys that those two priests tried to get. Bass tried to get me, Father Francis Bass, but I got away. And had it not been for wrestling and boxing, I mean, it was a physical moment where he grabbed me, but I wasn't a deer in the headlights. I was only 13, but I got away.
But you're saying that life can present you all kinds of unexpected insults and acts of aggression, and you should be physically and mentally prepared to resist.
These are techniques. It's nothing more than physics. It's down in that wrestling room over in Davenport as a boy, I was learning to respond appropriately to aggression.
The opposite of that would be if you're not prepared to resist illicit forms.
You're a victim.
You are inviting.
You're a victim. We create victims by not teaching our kids how to defend themselves.
Male and female.
Exactly. All children should be prepared to defend themselves appropriately against aggression. It's as old as civilization.
It's part of being an honorable adult.
It's a responsibility.
Yeah,
Socrates said that.
It's a duty.
It's our duty to be prepared to defend the highest ideals of the country.
My in-studio guest is Ed Thomas. He is a fitness guru, and as you hear, he's got a wide and varied background. You're welcome to join us at 284-1040 or 800-469-4295. Back in a moment. Right back to the conversation. Later we'll have lots and lots of open night time. Ed Thomas, though, is here in the studio with us. He is a fitness expert. What would it look like if you could duplicate your ideal K-12?
The first consideration is the understanding that even if a child is in physical education 5 days a week, an hour a day, that's a very small amount of their lifetime. So it's certainly going to take an effort at home, in the community. But if we were to zero in on the school, the first would be posture. We've got to start looking at the child again. In other words, the alignment, the way they move. The same care we take with our plants, we should take with our children. We don't want that plant growing crooked or the tree growing crooked. So the first is we've got to start looking at the way we place our children during the day. And the second is more emphasis on three elements: progression, variety, and precision. In elementary levels, it is important to let children play, not focus too much on structure. But by around fifth grade, if we were to go back and look at a physical education class in Iowa at about 1885 to 1920, we'd have a pretty good idea, perhaps World War II. And that would be, they come in, they know where they're supposed to be, and during that period of instruction, they will learn something. They will never come to class to work out again. The way we've justified that over the last 5 or 10 years is the schools that across the country that want to keep playing, they call it activity. And we emphasize that kids must be active. Well, jumping out of a window is activity.
So you say never work out?
They'll work their butts off, but they will be learning something. So the attitude changes when they come in. Today we are going to learn this.
Are there curriculums or are there plans? Is it conceptualized? I mean, could you just hand a phys ed teacher a book and say, after you have absorbed this, do this?
Experience helps, but we certainly have the technology to do it. We have video technology, we have books. We would have to rethink some of what we're doing at the post-secondary level and how we're preparing our physical education teachers. Sports so dominates our culture that, for instance, in many of our smaller schools, that youngster's going to get a physical education degree because they want to coach. And if they have to teach PE, so be it.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got to think differently about what physical education is and what it does. And that is that we train these physical educators to have the same eye that a chiropractor has or a physical therapist has.
They can see the kids that need help.
They can see the children.
They can read the kids by looking at them.
That's right. We can start looking at the child again.
Let's talk to as many people as we can, as quickly as we can, at 284-1040 or 800-469-4295. This is Gary. Good morning, Gary.
Hi, how you doing?
Doing great.
Hi, Gary.
Hi. The reason I'm calling, I'm 58 years old, and I was raised in a farm. My dad taught us how to box at an early age. I was a little guy. And so I agree with what Mr. Thomas says, and I also wrestled in junior high and high school. And it really helped me a lot. The only thing is, the question I have is, when I was younger, if you boxed a guy, if you fought a guy, you hit him, and the guy went down, my dad would always say, he's down, let him go. You don't kick, you don't get on top of him. Now it seems like our culture has changed so much that it seems to me the reason that a lot of these kids that do get into the martial arts do so to hurt somebody. I mean, not to protect themselves, not to be, a diplomatic fighter, a dignified fighter, but just to hurt somebody. And it scares me, that there are kids out there that have that level of aggression, that they have martial arts capabilities, and they just want to beat the hell out of somebody.
Well, that's the way that those mixed martial arts formats are arranged. And you either get them to submit and tap out, or you put them on. But that's the nature of the sport.
Man, kids watch that on TV, and they pick up on that. But what happened to the dignity? And I'm asking Mr. Thomas here, how do you address that in terms of, if you want to,
That's an interesting point because watching because that is in a controlled environment. We have a ref that can stop the violence when they see the other guy can't defend himself anymore. The kids on the street see this. Oh, that's the new ideal.
And they just beat the hell out of each other.
Yeah,
I mean, it happens all the time. Now, how do you stop that?
All right, talk to us about that. Thank you, Gary. Appreciate it. Those are great questions.
Thanks, Gary. Well, the cynics argue that we're just getting dumber as a country, and those are just dumb behaviors. But I suppose those of us that still have some optimism about our country would say that in the context of physical education, the martial and the off-the-ground component all depended upon the structure that the teacher created in the classroom or in the gymnasium. Like over in Davenport, and this would be the 1950s, very structured class, and our wrestling coach constantly reminded us to be noble, to be good, to be decent. We don't have that same sort of fire in our bellies
Well, if that's
anymore.
the case, then maybe it's dangerous equipping kids to be more violent and teaching them skills if they're just loading a weapon that people are not qualified to use. Mm-hmm.
Taekwondo is a great example. I lived for 2 years in Korea. Self-restraint is built into the Taekwondo environment. The respect for others, respect for elders. And even among the UFC guys, by the way, there's a tremendous amount of restraint embedded in their fighting. You have to look at it very carefully. But as you say, Gary, when that translates out to the backyards in a dysfunctional home,
mm-hmm.
you got a real recipe for disaster. So we certainly need some legislation that bans all dumb kids from training in martial arts.
Good luck with that. Let's talk to Bill. Good morning, Bill.
Hello.
There you go.
Oh, okay, it's Bill. Yeah, I was talking to my grandson.
We encourage that, by the way.
Well, he's going to learn self-defense, just like my other grandson. But what Ed was talking about, I experienced this when I was drafted back in '70, and right after that, they changed the height, weight, physical requirements for the men to match the women.
They dumbed down the physical requirements so they could justify getting women in the military.
Yeah, the four aspects that was in basic training when I went through there was the 150-yard man carry, 40-yard low crawl pit, pugil stick training, and individual hand-to-hand. And they eliminated those. I don't know what they do that nowadays, and I know the Marines that still do, Special Forces, and other.
All right, I think we got the central point here. There are fitness standards that are appropriate to the genders. I think you'd agree with that.
I've been around, as you know, the Army fitness for a long time, and I watched that happen. And the same thing happened in physical education with forced gender integration. There was a Colonel Osborne who was second in charge of one of the main studies that proved that men and women could train effectively together physically in the military. And I remember Art Osborne telling me they cooked the books on this one. It was going to happen no matter what.
So in other words, another thing that feminism has destroyed.
And what's really interesting about it is that the women prior to that period had really good physical training doctrine. I still use the women's PT manuals. They were brilliant. They went back to the 1940s. And so, again, it was something happening to the country, something that we were doing to ourselves that made these changes. And
no, it was a political minority captured the flag and inflicted politics over common sense. It happens a lot.
Something happened, and you're absolutely right.
They haven't recovered from it either.
Well, I'll give you another example then. We came up with 3 tests that everyone could do: push-ups, sit-ups, and a 2-mile run. The long run is because running was in back then. But the push-ups, and the women knew all the way back to World War II that women have a very difficult time doing the precise push-up. And the whole purpose of a push-up is to teach someone to prepare to push somebody or something. So the elbow has to be in line with the hand. It has to be mechanically correct. Once they said we're all going to do push-ups, they took that requirement out. So things that don't even resemble push-ups now began to dominate. So the numbers crept up as the quality went down. So we've actually been hurting our soldiers with the way we do the push-ups since the 1980s because of their poorly done push-ups. They don't prepare us to do anything. But all this goes back to mistakes that are made, oftentimes by people who know nothing about physical training, unfortunately.
Gee. That happened to the banking, that happened to the housing industry, that happened to everything that the socialists have and radicals did. They just turned to
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. I started giving...
Hang on, Doc. I need to take a short time, our last one. And we'll go right back to the conversation. You're welcome to join us. Dr. Ed Thomas is our guest. Later, we'll have some open line time right here on 1040 WHO.
WHO.
Right now, Dr. Ed Thomas is our in-studio guest. You're going to tell us the story of the World War II standards and talking about the calisthenics.
Well, in the 1990s, I began giving the World War II physical readiness training test, Army PT test, to soldiers. Started with the Ranger community, and they did well. But as we spread out across the system, we found, for instance, that the average number of push-ups in some units, these are soldiers that could do 50 or 100 push-ups with the current standard. We were coming in at an average around 15, and it was less than 1 for the women. In other words,
how do you have less than 1?
Well, they were
a negative push-up.
Right, they were. Well, they were. Many weren't able to do any.
Okay, gotcha.
So they're coming in less than 1. The point is that, in other words, movements that were preparing them to function on the battlefield weren't being reflected in their physical fitness test. And the sit-up is another great example. The damage done in sit-ups is well established, but the trains on the tracks, it's hard to turn it around.
What do you mean the damage done in sit-ups?
There's a fellow named Stu McGill who's done some of the best work. Dr. Stu McGill, he's out of Canada. He's a spine specialist, and he's done a tremendous amount of work on the damage done to a human spine through the standard sit-up. And that led years ago to...
I do crunches. I don't
crunches,
do...
yeah.
Is that okay? I mean...
But it's a lot less damage than the military sit-up, which puts the hands behind the back.
Yes.
So you see a lot of hyperflexion, a lot of pulling on the neck.
Right.
So if you were to look at the core as a group of muscles, which is what we're trying to fix, then all the dynamic movements of the core and all the different ranges are what we need to make the core strong. We spend the day in flexion, so you could argue that doing more flexion isn't necessarily going to help you very much over time. So extension is probably more important than flexion for spinal health for people who sit a lot.
Okay. Now, you're talking about different kinds of push-up. What do you mean by the proper push-up?
If your car is stalled out there and we're going outside and you say, hey, Thomas, help me push my car, and I stick my elbows out and my thumbs are off the car and my head's all out of line, you look at me and say, well, thanks, I don't think I'll need you. Right? You know I don't know what I'm doing, but if I have the elbows back, my back heel's off the ground, my body's aligned, there's a certain look to doing it well.
So your elbows should be in.
Elbows and hands should all be aligned the same way you would push something. You want everything lined up.
So your elbows way out? Not good.
Not for pushing. You wouldn't push anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah. So if we're training functionally, if we want to train ourselves to move in time and space and to load bear, we have to look very carefully at the movements we make.
Well, I have some style changes. It sounds like I'm going to have to make.
They take a little time because they're demanding a little bit more from the body.
Yeah, that's why I'm doing them the other way. I might not be able to do a couple hundred the real way. This is Dave. Good morning. You're a teacher. You have an observation to make.
Yeah, I'm a math teacher, but I've also coached. I'll make this real quick. I'm an Air Force Vietnam veteran, and this gentleman will tell you this. The Air Force, Kenneth Cooper, who's in charge of the Cooper Institute.
Yeah, the
aerobics
guy.
One of the first aerobic people.
Yeah.
And I tell you, one thing that the politicians are hiding and the CDC's hiding, this type 2 diabetes, you think your health care budget is broke now. Wait till that happens. And here's the sad thing. Most type 2 diabetes is all preventable if you just just get off your butt and walk 20 minutes a day and not even change your diet. And we could improve that. And this gentleman will tell you that, and it's going to hit us. I think it's already too late. Anyway, I appreciate y'all.
Hey, thanks a lot, Dave. You bet.
Well,
I think not only is it preventable,
service,
but it's reversible, too.
It is. Yeah, there are 3 issues. Kids today are inert, which is what Dave was talking about.
Right.
They're malformed, and they're clumsy. We have to address all 3 of those. If we teach children to move well, we will not have to encourage them to move often. If they don't move well, they're not going to move. They would rather sit and watch someone else move and let their brain trick them into thinking it's them. That's why they cock their arm when the quarterback throws. Right?
Yes.
Right? They're tricking themselves.
Well, or playing really violent video games and thinking you're getting an aerobic workout.
Their central nervous system, in some way, believes that that they're doing that.
Now, if we could just figure out a way to make that true, wouldn't that be cool? Just thinking about exercise would be as good as doing it?
Well, there's certainly the idea of mental practice, which
Right.
in some ways does help if you're working on a fine motor skill.
Somebody wanted to know, real quick, how do you get kids to exercise if they're not really willing to?
Teach them to move well. Teach them instead of ask them just to move. Teach them something.
Okay. All right. Some people also know, where can people go for curriculum?
Teach them something that they can do. Never teach them things they can't do forever, that they'll never be able to do.
Okay. Hey, Doc, thank you for coming over here. I really appreciate it.
Always nice, Jan. Stay healthy.